And then from the 16th of February, there's a surge of ceasefire violations. Now, if you remember at that time, the Americans, strangely, had announced that Russia would attack on that day. So why did they make this announcement? It is still a bit of a mystery to me to now why Americans decided to announce in advance the day when the Russians would actually invade Ukraine. But on 16th, there was no invasion, but there was an upsurge of ceasefire violations, which was actually monitored by the OSCE. But based on the statistics of the OSCE at that moment, I couldn't tell who was in charge, who was responsible. And then this increase of ceasefire violations continued the following day and so forth until the 24th, actually, when Russia decides to basically launch its special military operation. But it's like an 8 days process. And during this 8 days process beforehand, you see the ceasefire violations, they go up. And initially I thought, well, maybe it's the Russians preparing their own offensive. So my initial idea was that it was the Russians, most likely, who were like preparing their offensive by shelling. But then when I actually looked deeper into the official reports of the OSCE, which I later read thoroughly, and also from discussions I had with colleagues, I concluded differently. I concluded that it was most likely the Ukrainians who were at that moment provoking. And this I got from two different sources who were present in the Lugansk Oblast when the thing started. In Popasna, city of Popasna, we had a local base there. And from a testimony of a colleague I had, he said Ukrainians are shelling heavily from Popasna. And this is how it started. This was confirmed to me by somebody higher up the chain who said, yes, the Ukrainians organized a provocation from Popasna. So I had two sources inside OSCE who told me that. And then when you look at the statistics of the ceasefire violations, and I know very well how they are compiled, I know how it functions, and I know very well also where all the cameras of OSCE were deployed, because we were monitoring a big part of the ceasefire violations with cameras. Now, during daytime, whenever you have our own observers, human observation saying, oh, I heard an explosion on that from that direction, you cannot say for sure whether it's outgoing or incoming. And whether you interpret one or the other, it changes completely how you interpret the information that you have, right? So this is not reliable. In other terms, this is not reliable. The only thing that is like 100% reliable is the data from the cameras at night. Because, when the people shell each other at night, in order to aim, they shell with flares, right? So some of the flares that they shell, some of the shells that they use have flares, which means they can follow the trajectory in the sky. And so our cameras could perfectly locate that. And based on the locations of the cameras, when you knew them, which I did, and when because we had perfectly knew where the positions of both sides, we had a map about this. I knew who was shelling whom. And as I said in the conclusion of my book, from every time we had that night cameras observation, it was mostly Ukrainian lines shelling separatist lines. So conclusion was that it was the Ukrainian military who, in most likeliness, organized this provocation, as if they wanted Russia to attack, which is, it's
to the final provocation in order to make sure that now they would cross.
In order to make sure Russia would attack.
And the moment these tanks crossed was the moment when in Washington and Brussels they opened the big champagne bottles, because that's what you needed. That's the moment when you then.
And I concluded that they wanted it to happen, because if you provoke Russia into attacking, then you present Ukraine as a victim in front of the eyes of the whole world, and people only see that. People who don't follow in detail, they only see about, oh, Russia invades without reason. Its neighbor, it's horrible, right? And everybody's shocked, and everybody thinks Russia is wrong, and they are barbarians. And then there was the whole series of specific events, which in most cases, in my view, were organized by the Ukrainian system. They organized provocations, Bucha, for instance, of a Kramatorsk train station, which is, I will talk about that in my next book. But because I also investigated these events, and I concluded that many such events are very suspicious in many ways, and appear to me as provocations by the Ukrainian side to portray the Russians as barbarians with whom you could not negotiate. I mean, take the timing of Bucha. Bucha just occurs when Ukrainians and Russians are close to an agreement in Istanbul. And as a sign of goodwill, initially it was a sign of goodwill by Putin, he withdraws all his troops from the north of Ukraine, around Kiev. They didn't have to do it, but they did. On the same day, all the forces left. According to the Russian side, it was a way to show the Ukrainian delegation that they really meant to respect the agreement, which was the best agreement Ukraine could have hoped for, because they agreed to, I even had problems to believe it when I read it. They had agreed to withdraw behind the line of 24 February 2022, which was amazing for me. But they were willing to do that in exchange of Ukraine committing never to join NATO and to downscaling its own military.
Yeah,
So not to be
agree
afraid.
to do its neutrality agreement, and they were almost
Yep.
there. They were so close.
They were
so
almost
close.
there. And then a few days later, Bucha occurs, and then Boris Johnson comes to visit Zelensky and says, "Oh, you cannot negotiate with Russians. We will help you to defend yourself with NATO weapons, and you will win this militarily." And there were many people, including now, who tell me, "Well, how can you negotiate with Russians after Bucha?" So, cui bono, as they say in Latin, right? Who benefits from the crime? And in this case, you can clearly see that Bucha benefited whom? People who didn't want a peace agreement to be signed with Russia. Those people benefited from Bucha. And again, when you look into it, there are many suspicious things in Bucha. I'm not saying that Russian troops did not do anything wrong. They might have done some crimes over there, but not to the scale of what was alleged. And I think at least part of what happened in Bucha was largely a fabrication by Ukrainian authorities.